This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Gables, Garridebs, and students all came in 3-packs, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's the difference between a gamekeeper and a gatekeeper? Between a Tregennis and a Tregallis? Between a Jack in office and a Mr. Cocksure?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 440, On the Hound. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I'd like to offer you these drinks on the Hound. No, on the house.
Well, I'm glad they're on the house because they always slide off the back of the Hound, and it's a mess to clean up.
And they do come out glowing if they've been on the Hound. So I don't know if you want phosphorus on your lips. Yes. Well, this is the first episode of the month, and that means that we are looking at a Morley-Montgomery Award-winning article. Just as a reminder, the Morley-Montgomery Award is bestowed upon the article that has been deemed by a panel of judges to be the best article of the year in the Baker Street Journal. And this year we are working through a dozen or so of those. This one comes to us from 1975, from volume 25, number 3 of the Baker Street Journal. It's called On the Hound by Michael L. Burton, where he looks at the breed of the Hound of the Baskervilles. Should be an interesting and enlightening article, seeing that it is award-winning. So stick with us to hear more about it. Meanwhile, if you'd like to support the show, you can do that on Substack or Patreon. We have communities where people can comment on our content, ask questions, get involved with each other. They also receive bonus content from time to time, including our Trifling Trifles episodes. That is, episodes or topics that we feel that are too short to be dedicated to a full-length episode like you're about to get. So pick your poison, Substack, Patreon, decide which you'd like to support for as little as $1 a month, and join us as a member of the community there. You won't regret it. Okay, we find ourselves in the informative hands of one Dr. Michael L. Burton. Dr. Burton was an assistant professor of aerospace studies at the University of Portland and was a founder member of the Noble and Most Singular Order of the Blue Carbuncle, and was a correspondent for the order and published its newsletter, Feathers from the Nest. And he, in addition to his regular teaching duties, he used to conduct a continuing education course, that is ED 221B, on Sherlock Holmes. And over the years, I suppose this was inevitable, he discovered that more people were interested in Sherlock Holmes than his creator. So, Dr. Burton will take us on a sinological journey as we try to identify the breed of the Hound of the Baskervilles.
Yes, and in his essay from 1975, he really begins exactly with that question. He tells us dogs have played a significant role in many of the cases of the canon, but none, of course, equals that of the savage and legendary canine of the Hound, after Holmes had put the sixth or seventh bullet into the so-called Hound of Hell, permanently ending its career, Watson asks, what was it? What in heaven's name was it? Well, what indeed? Holmes, of course, replies, it's dead, whatever it is. But still, the good doctor, says Burton, enlightens the reader further in describing the beast as not a pure bloodhound, not a pure mastiff, but it appeared to be a combination of the two, gaunt, savage, and as large as a small lioness. The question of exactly what the hound was has plagued Sherlockians over the years. People have dismissed Watson's observation perhaps as being untenable because of his history. Owen Frisbee, in an essay he wrote on the origin of the hound, commented that the hound could not be a combination of a mastiff and a bloodhound, but concludes that one must look to a combination of a staghound for size and drive and to a bloodhound for ability and will to take the line of a human. And another writer, Stuart Palmer, felt the hound was some mixture of Great Dane or Scottish Wolfhound. Well, that sets Michael Burton off on this journey.
It does. He says he has to take exception with both views because it's not one that's simply determined. And of course, Watson himself doesn't really help matters. His description is illuminating, but not enlightening. Details about the size and shape of the head of the beast and its ears and jowls and brow would help make a determination. And, thinking about the type and color of the coat that the hound possessed, that would have given us better insight into the type of animal. But Holmes would, of course, admonish, because we must deal with the facts at hand, however obscure. So, writes Burton, let us proceed. The first question is what Watson meant when he said mastiff. Now, etymologists have had a field day in attempting to explain the origin of the word mastiff. Going back into the 1800s, the history of the mastiff claims that it's a Norman corruption of the Greek word molossi. The molossi were people who lived in Epirus, and they had guard dogs, and they were known as canes molossi. Canes, of course, being Latin for dogs. But in the theory of Mr. James Watson, not to be confused with Dr. John Watson, or even Dr. James Watson, as his wife would call him, Mr. James Watson was a famous British dog breeder. He published in 1906 The Dog Book. Well, how's that for a bestseller? And contends that mastiff stems not from the Norman, but from the Saxon mastin, M-A-S-T-I-N, a term given to any dog, usually a mongrel or crossbreed, and usually one used as a guard dog. But Mr. Watson claims that mastiff, as it applies to a particular breed, came into common use only in the 1850s. And scholars today, like the American Mastiff Club, would agree. Mastiff originated in the north of England, is derived from the Latin mastinus, the adjective corresponding to mansata, a household, therefore meaning a house dog. So, it's a dog that is tied up.
It's fascinating here. You have to wonder about Burton, whether or not he did all this research because he was just curious, or whether or not he had some additional academic specialty into all of this, that he gets into some of this stuff. But also, you can't skip over the fact we just learned that Mr. James Watson was a famous British dog breeder. So it's possible that when Mary Morstan said, do you think I should send James to bed, that James Watson was in Watson's house, probably providing a dog to Mary. And nobody just mentioned him, that he was part of the conversation.
Well, there's another tale I don't know if the world is prepared for, but John Watson was over in James Watson's house canoodling with his wife. So,
oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, dear. Well, Burton will now take us through the history of the term Mastiff. It was applied to many kinds of dogs. By the 1850s, the Mastiff was generally regarded as a breed unto itself. The Old English Mastiff Club was formed in Britain in 1883. Now, the earliest date assigned to the Hound of the Baskervilles is 1886, according to H.W. Bell. That's a good 3 years after the formal recognition of the Mastiff as a breed. If we accept Baring Gould's date of 1888 for the case, and here, of course, Burton is relating this to the chronologists trying to date the time of the events of Hound of the Baskervilles, there's even more time for the breed to have become accepted. Watson, who read the newspapers, must surely have read the accounts of champion mastiffs shown in the dog shows of London in the 1880s. And Holmes also uses the word mastiff in this case in describing the teeth marks on Dr. Mortimer's walking stick. Holmes observes the marks were too broad for a terrier and not broad enough for a mastiff. Well, even if Watson chose to put down Holmes's remarks in the lowercase, Holmes would never be so imprecise in his descriptions to use a word like mastiff in its general meaning, especially when comparing it to a specific breed, such as a terrier. Well, Watson uses a specific breed, the bloodhound, in connection with the term mastiff, in describing the hound's characteristics. So we must accept, says Burton, that Watson knew precisely what he was saying in reference to the mastiff, a specific breed of dog then recognized in Britain. But, says Burton, now, what about the question of the bloodhound?
Yeah, what about the question of the bloodhound?
Yeah.
Where was he on the night of October? No. Watson tells us that the hound was neither pure mastiff nor pure bloodhound. And if we accept that Watson was familiar with the mastiff, then we could easily conclude that he was also familiar with the much more generally known bloodhound. The bloodhound was a breed well founded in England by this time, and the bloodhound actually traces back to the old St. Hubert hounds of the 8th century. The wealthy bishops of that day bred these dogs so carefully and so aristocratically that the dogs came to be called blooded hounds. And many believe that this is the derivation of the name for the bloodhound. Johannes Caius, the Elizabethan authority, offered another explanation. The dog was simply called bloodhound with a final E, or sanguinarius, for its skill in following the blood scent of wounded game. But more of the bloodhound's tracking abilities later. Now we've established that Watson knew something of the breeds of which he spoke. So now we must establish whether he was speaking of those specific breeds, or whether he was assigning general characteristics of those breeds to the hound. Now, to Watson, the most impressive feature of the hound was its was its size and strength. He refers to it as huge, giant, enormous, and as large as a small lioness. That description always got me. So we could easily see why Palmer and Frisbee, in their pieces we noted earlier, would naturally turn to the Great Dane or to hunting hounds in selecting the probable ancestry of the hound. But Watson was on the scene, and Palmer and Frisbee were not, writes Burton. So let's see if their assumptions are correct. The Great Dane, obviously a large dog, standing up to 32 inches at the shoulder. The Irish Wolfhound is the tallest of all dogs, standing up to 38 inches at the shoulder. The Scottish Deerhound is big, but not as large as either the Irish Wolfhound or the Great Dane. So, Burton writes, I'm assuming that Palmer means Irish Wolfhound when he speaks of a Scottish Wolfhound. If he means Scottish Deerhound, he's speaking of a much smaller dog. And as to Frisbee's Staghound, it would be difficult to show that any such dog existed in the 19th century. staghound was a dog of considerable size used by the ancient Scots to hunt the fabled Highland elk. The staghound seems to have faded into legend with the demise of the Highland elk when that noble animal came extinct.
Speaking of extinction, the Irish wolfhound itself almost faced extinction in the early 19th century. It was saved by Captain Graham of the British Army, who in 1862 collected some of the last survivors of the breed and crossed them with the Scottish deerhound, Great Dane, Mastiff, and Borzoi to restore Ireland's wolfhound to his traditional appearance and stature. And now Burton's going to take us through some qualities of the Mastiff that we might condense here a little bit. The Mastiff is not as tall on the average as a Great Dane, Wolfhound, or a Deerhound. The standard Mastiff is required to have a minimum shoulder height of 30 inches, and a good-sized male can go up to 33 inches. But height alone does not make a big dog. In weight, the Mastiff stands alone. An average male will easily weigh 180 pounds. While there are some that reach the preponderous scale of 240 pounds.
Wow.
A good-sized Great Dane will weigh about 150 pounds, while the Wolfhound rarely exceeds 140 pounds. But probably one of the most impressive features of the Mastiff is the head. The massive size of the cranium often makes the head look out of proportion to the body. The muscular cheeks, the square jaw, the heavy jowls give the Mastiff a fierce look, suited to the hound of hell. The slender face and muzzle of the wolfhound would hardly fit this description, or the elegant features of the Great Dane would not match also the description of the animal conjured up by Watson's description. Watson also mentions on first seeing the hound that its muzzle and hackles and dewlap were outlined in flickering flame. The dewlap is a loose fold of skin under the chin of a dog, not noticeable in the Dane or Wolfhound, but pronounced in both the Mastiff and Bloodhound. The Bloodhound side of the hound could do little to detract from the size of the beast. The Bloodhound is by no means, by the way, a small dog, even though it is much shorter than any of the previously mentioned hounds.
Yeah, the Bloodhound is still fairly massive. Some males reach 110 pounds, stand 27 inches high at the shoulder. So Frisbee's correct in assuming that the hound got its ability to take the line of a human from the Bloodhound. The tracking abilities of the Bloodhound are legendary. And Holmes knew this because he worked with bloodhounds to track down criminals. And having been told by Dr. Mortimer that the footprints of a gigantic hound, oh, that phrase still sends a chill through my body, had been found near the body of Sir Charles, Holmes probably already correctly concluded that the beast had tracked its prey. So he knew the best dog for scenting a trail would be a bloodhound, or a dog of bloodhound mixture. So it was perhaps more than a pun when Holmes warned Sir Henry that he was being dogged in London. But beyond the size and the tracking ability is the question of temperament of these dogs. The Bloodhound has been depicted as the meanest of dogs since chasing little Eliza across the ice in Uncle Tom's Cabin, but this is undeserved. Burton writes, he said, Bloodhound's a very gentle dog and takes the chase only for its own sake, with malice towards none. That doesn't really fit the description of the hound that struck terror into the heart of Watson. But introduce the Mastiff, however, and the characteristics fall more easily into place. The Mastiff, as we mentioned before, has been used for centuries as a guard dog. Henry VIII presented Mastiffs to Charles V to be used as fighting dogs in war. They were also used in Britain for bear baiting, several Mastiffs reportedly being able to kill a bear. Given such a combination, well, it's no wonder that Holmes and Watson took at least 6 shots to kill the beast. Of course, any dog can be made ferocious, and a man like Stapleton would be capable of turning even the friendliest pooch into a snarling fiend. Can you imagine the golden doodle of the Baskervilles?
I like that. That's a great story. I say, Dr. Watson, this is a very successful tale, you know, but Golden Doodle doesn't quite make it, don't you think? Well, finally, says Burton, there's the question of color. Several times, Watson refers to the hound as being black, coal black, in fact. The Great Dane is the only dog for our purposes that has the standard color of black. Wolfhound color range to a dark blue-gray, but not coal black. The Bloodhound is tawny and black, the black quite often being predominant. The Mastiff ranges in color from apricot to dark brindle. So while a black Great Dane would seem to fit the description of the beast for color at least, a crossbred Mastiff Bloodhound could conceivably be black. And as we mentioned before, had Watson provided us with other facts relative to the formation of the hound, its coat, the shape of its head, a more positive determination of the origin of the beast could be made. But with the evidence at hand, we have to conclude that Watson was correct in determining that it was part Mastiff and part Bloodhound. The size could come from none other than the Mastiff. What the lion is to the cat, the Mastiff is to the dog. Read a 19th century opinion of this giant breed, and mixed with the Bloodhound and Stapleton's evil purposes, the resulting hound would be a terrifying spectre indeed on the murky moors of the Grimpen Mire. But as Holmes said, it's dead, whatever it is, and may we be so fortunate as never to see another like it again.
And there's a lovely footnote here where Burton says, I'd also disagree with Palmer about the number of shots it took to kill the hound. He states that it took 5 bullets to end the life of the beast. I would hold that it took at least 6 and possibly even 7 bullets to kill the creature. Palmer apparently overlooked the first 2 shots fired at the hound by Holmes and Watson once they recovered from their initial shock on confronting the beast. After his nerve returned, Watson states that Holmes and I both fired together, and the creature gave a hideous howl, which showed that at least one had hit him. It was a few moments later, when the hound had Sir Henry by the throat, that Holmes emptied 5 barrels of his revolver into the creature's flank. Yeah, that's one of those interesting little details when you piece together, different portions of the narrative. We suddenly find something takes on new meaning. I think we talked about that with the boots in the Hound of the Baskervilles a few episodes ago.
Yes, by George Fletcher.
By our friend George Fletcher, yeah. That just pops out.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you buy Burton's argument of the hound being a mix of bloodhound and mastiff?
Well, it's sort of a long voyage to get to where Dr. Watson started us off in the first place. So I have to say yes.
You noticed that too, did you?
But I appreciate the knowledge and the inquiry, which is certainly thorough, which is what you can expect, after all, when you take a look at these trifles.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
And the possessor of a dog. Can I see the stick?
What? Oh, thank you.
Larger than a terrier. Smaller than a mastiff.